A ceasefire has been declared. The guns have gone quiet. But this is not peace, and in the Middle East, this kind of silence can be the most dangerous moment of all on the surface. It looked like a breakthrough after weeks of mounting pressure, drone strikes, naval confrontations, intelligence warnings, and back-channel negotiations conducted through intermediaries in Oman and Qatar. Both Washington and Tehran stepped back from the edge. Ceasefire was announced, not through a joint press conference, not through a formal treaty signing, but through carefully worded statements released almost simultaneously, as if neither side wanted to appear to be the one who blinked first. The White House described the agreement as a product of sustained diplomatic pressure. The language was measured. Officials spoke of a mutual understanding, a phrase deliberately vague enough to mean different things to different audiences. In Tehran, the announcement was framed differently. State media described it as a demonstration of Iranian resilience, a confirmation that the Islamic Republic had withstood American coercion and emerged without surrendering its core positions. Two sides, one ceasefire, two completely different stories about what it means. In the days that followed, the immediate optics were encouraging. Shipping lanes in the Strait of Hormuz, which had been shadowed by Iranian naval vessels and threatened by the specter of interdiction, appeared calmer. American carrier strike groups in the region to maintain their positions, but reduced their operational tempo. Satellite imagery showed Iranian forces at several forward deployment sites, pulling back. Not entirely, not permanently, but enough to register on the diplomatic instruments that track such things. Markets responded with cautious relief. Oil prices, which had surged on fear of regional disruption, pulled back slightly. That the risk premium built into crude had not entirely disappeared, but it had softened in European capitals and Gulf states. Diplomats exhaled. The language of crisis management gave way briefly to the language of opportunity. Maybe, some said, this was the beginning of something. Maybe this was the opening of a longer negotiation. But here's the real problem. A ceasefire between the United States and Iran is not a peace agreement. It is not even the beginning of one. It is, at best, a mutual acknowledgement that the cost of continued escalation had become for the moment too high for both sides to bear, and the conditions that produced this crisis, the structural tensions, the competing interests, the accumulated distrust of more than 4 decades, remain not just intact, but arguably more entrenched than before. To understand why this ceasefire is misleading, you have to look not at what stopped, but at what did in single quotes t. Iranian-aligned forces in Iraq have not disarmed the Houthi movement in Yemen, which Iran has armed, trained, and advised for years, has not stood down Hezbollah in Lebanon, that remains the most powerful non-state military actor in the Middle East, with an arsenal that American and Israeli intelligence estimate includes over 150,000 rockets and missiles. More than most standing armies in the world, these forces did not cease to exist. When the ceasefire was announced, they did not hand in their weapons. They did not change their strategic orientation. They paused in some cases, but a pause, it is not the same as stopping. In the waters of the Persian Gulf, American naval assets remain on heightened alert. The USS Nimitz and its carrier strike group did not sail home. They repositioned, and that distinction matters enormously. Repositioning is a tactical adjustment within a posture of readiness that signals that the United States has not concluded that the threat has passed. It signals that the conditions for conflict have not fundamentally changed. Meanwhile, Israel, which operates according to its own strategic calculus, that has not moderated its stance. Israeli airstrikes in Syria, targeting Iranian weapons transfers and Revolutionary Guard positions, continued even in the weeks surrounding the ceasefire announcement. Israel's position has always been clear. It cannot allow Iran to consolidate a permanent military presence in Syria regardless of what diplomatic arrangement Washington and Tehran reach. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran does not bind Israel. And Iran knows this. This is where things become dangerous, because in the architecture of this conflict, there are multiple actors operating at the same time. Each with their own objectives, their own thresholds, their own definitions of acceptable risk. A ceasefire that covers only Washington and Tehran leaves enormous amounts of combustible material still burning. The Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE, watched the ceasefire announcement with deep ambivalence. On one level, any reduction in direct confrontation reduces the risk of catastrophic regional war. But on another level, these governments have spent years arguing that American deterrence must be credible, that Washington must be willing to pay a real cost to contain Iranian regional ambitions. So when they see a ceasefire announced without any corresponding Iranian concession on proxy activity, on missile capabilities, on regional behavior, they read it differently. Not as diplomacy, but as retreat. And that perception whether fair or not, has consequences. It shapes how Gulf states calculate security, arms procurement, energy policy, strategic alignment. A ceasefire that erodes credibility does not stabilize the region, that shifts instability into forms that are harder to see but no less dangerous. But to understand the full depth of this problem, you have to go further back. You have to understand the structure of this conflict, because it did not begin with this crisis, and it will not end with this ceasefire. This means that even if Iran wanted to fully deactivate this network as part of a diplomatic arrangement, and there is no evidence it does, it could not do so. At the flip of a switch, the Houthis have their own reasons to continue fighting, has its own political position in Lebanon to protect Iraqi militias, to have their own relationships with the Iraqi state, their own economic interests, their own internal dynamics. Telling them all to stand down requires leverage that Iran does not fully possess, even over actors it helped create. So what happens next? The ceasefire between Washington and Tehran may reduce the risk of direct military exchange, but it does nothing to address the underlying engine of instability. The network of armed groups will continue to operate. To probe, to occasionally strike, and to provide Iran with plausible deniability. This is the part that doesn't stop. Here is the hardest truth about this moment: ceasefires in complex multi-actor conflicts do not create stability. They create a new phase of the conflict, one that is often more dangerous because it allows both sides to rebuild, to recalculate, to reposition while the world's attention moves elsewhere. The risk of miscalculation is not theoretical, it is built into the system itself. Consider what that actually means. American forces in the region, we operate under rules of engagement that allow them to respond to Iranian-aligned threats. Iranian-aligned forces, we operate under instructions that are sometimes clear and sometimes deliberately ambiguous, giving Tehran the option to claim or deny responsibility, depending on how events unfold. In an environment with limited communication, limited trust, and heavy domestic pressure, the margin for error becomes extremely thin. A ship captain in the Strait of Hormuz makes a decision in seconds. A drone operator receives incomplete intelligence. A militia commander fires a rocket, and suddenly everything changes. Any one of these moments, under the wrong conditions, with the wrong consequences, can unravel a ceasefire in hours. History offers warnings. The 1914 assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand did not cause a world war on its own, but it happened inside a system already primed for collapse. Alliances, tension, mobilization plans. Everything was already in place, and what followed looked like rational decisions. At the time, the US-Iran conflict, it is not World War I, but the structure shares familiar risks, multiple actors, limited trust, accumulated pressure enough to take seriously. This is where things become dangerous in a different way, because a ceasefire can reduce urgency. When tension is high, there is pressure to act, to negotiate, to compromise, because the alternative is clearly catastrophic. But a ceasefire removes that pressure. It creates the illusion of progress, without requiring real change. And the longer the core issues remain unresolved, the deeper the positions harden. From here, there are three possible paths, none of them comfortable, none of them stable. The first is control. Calm. The ceasefire holds. No direct conflict. Diplomatic contacts continue. Language stays measured, but beneath the surface, the shadow conflict continues. Proxy activity. Cyber operations. Intelligence moves below the threshold of open war. This looks like stability, but it isn't. It is stability built on uncertainty. The kind that can last for years and then collapse in a single moment. The second path is continued shadow conflict. The most likely scenario: the conflict continues, but remains unofficial through pressure. Through proxies, through indirect confrontation. The nuclear program advances. Regional actors continue building strength. Sanctions continue. Tensions accumulate until another crisis forms. Not planned, but inevitable. The third path is a return to open confrontation. Not necessarily full-scale war, but something enough to break the current balance. A strike, a major incident, a political decision, and suddenly, the ceasefire no longer holds. And this time, the escalation may be faster, more intense, harder to control, because both sides have already prepared for what comes next. There is a fundamental question at the heart of all of this, a question that is rarely asked directly, because the answer, it is uncomfortable. What would it actually take to resolve this conflict? Not manage it, not contain it, not contain it, not declare a ceasefire every few years and call it progress. Resolve it. End it. Reach a point where the United States and Iran have a relationship that is genuinely stable, not because of mutual deterrence, not because both sides fear catastrophe, but because the underlying sources of the conflict have been addressed. The honest answer is that those conditions do not exist, not now. The nuclear issue, it cannot be resolved without Iran accepting limitations that its political system defines as existential limitations. Its leadership cannot accept without appearing to surrender, and that is politically impossible. The proxy warfare network cannot be dismantled without Iran giving up its primary tool of regional power, a system built over decades at enormous cost, a system it believes is essential to survival. And then there is trust, or rather, the complete absence of it. 40-5 years of hostility, broken agreements, sanctions, cyber attacks, proxy wars. That weight does not disappear with a ceasefire statement. This does not mean the conflict is permanent. History shows otherwise. The United States and Vietnam. European powers, after two catastrophic wars, former enemies who now cooperate. Trade. Align. But those transformations required something specific: leadership willing to take risks to absorb political cost, a shared realization that the current path was unsustainable. And time spent building trust. Step by step verified. None of those conditions are reliably present. Right now, Washington faces domestic pressure. Any agreement with Iran without visible concessions would be politically devastating. In Tehran, power is fragmented. The supreme leader, the Revolutionary Guards, the elected government, not always aligned, not always pursuing the same outcome, and compromise is not just policy, it is identity. Under these conditions, even small steps become almost impossible. So what remains is not resolution. But management. An unresolved conflict entering a new phase. The ceasefire is real. Something has changed. The immediate risk of direct military confrontation has declined. That matters. People are safer, ships are moving, the system is functioning slightly better than before. But the structure is intact. The nuclear program continues. The proxy network remains active. The distrust has not moved. The global competition has intensified. The constraints on diplomacy remain. The ceasefire bought time. Time is valuable, but time is not a solution. It is an opportunity that has been missed before. Repeatedly, and there is no strong reason to believe this time will be different. In the coming months, the real test will not come from statements. Not from press conferences. Not from diplomatic language, but from what happens out of sight. Will enrichment slow or accelerate? Will proxy forces step back or continue? Will communication hold when the next incident happens? Because it will happen. Will internal pressure in Iran push toward compromise or confrontation? Will American politics allow sustained diplomacy or shut it down? These are not abstract questions. They are the mechanics of what comes next. And right now, the answers are uncertain. There is a temptation to believe that this ceasefire means more than it does, that it signals progress, that it opens a path toward stability, that it is the beginning of the end. That temptation is dangerous hope without clear analysis. It is not strategy, it is wishful thinking. And in this region, wishful thinking has consequences. The United States and Iran are not at peace. They are not on a path to peace. They are in a pause, a managed pause, inside a long-running conflict, one that will continue until its foundations change. And those foundations have not changed. The ceasefire is real, but it is standing on unstable ground. The world should welcome it and use it, because the window it creates will not stay open forever. Pressure will return. Politics will harden. And the next incident will test everything. The question is not whether this ceasefire will last. It won't. The question is what is done with the time it created. History is full of ceasefires that looked like endings but weren't. The First World War ended in silence, and 2 decades later, the world burned again. The Korean War stopped, but never truly ended. Lebanon has seen silence turned back into war again and again. This moment belongs to that same pattern. It is not peace, it is not the end, it may not even be the most important moment. Because in conflicts like this, the quiet moments are where the next crisis begins. The Strait of Hormuz is quieter today, the channels are open, the ceasefire is holding for now. But beneath that silence, nothing is stopped. The centrifuges spin. The networks plan. The mistrust deepens, and both sides are already thinking about what comes next. Not because they want war, but because they do not believe peace is real. This is not the end of the US-Iran crisis. It is a pause. Fragile. Uncertain. And already under pressure. The danger has not disappeared, it has only changed shape, and the question is not if it will return, but when. Strategic analysis helps us understand escalation, but understanding conflict does not mean wishing for it. History repeatedly shows that war, in any form, carries costs that extend far beyond military objectives: economic disruption, political instability, and human suffering rarely remain confined to battlefields. Whatever the strategic calculations, the hope remains the same, that tensions are contained before they harden into open conflict, and that decisions made in the first hours prevent consequences that could last for decades, because in the end, no doctrine, no missile system, and no alliance structure can erase the long-term cost of war.